the community. These fairs and bonfire picnics make their sea pie in the arena. They're cooked in the big church vats, the big church ovens and things like that. So those are some of the resources that are potentially disappearing. And with harder and harsher food and safety standards, it's one of those things that just might be, disappearing or sanitized to the point where it can't be made to the same extent. So these are certain foods anyways that my family talked about that they didn't necessarily need to eat at a certain time of year, but they strongly identified as being French-Canadian, and foods that I feel really need to be explored over, beyond. Right, so just like last night when we were at eating our dinner, sea pie would have been something that they would have made for this Russian cruise because it could feed a large group of people. If it was Friday, they would have made salmon pie. But my grandpa talks about his mom making sea pie and beans in the middle of summer to feed large groups because it's hearty and really filling. So basically what I noticed throughout by looking at both sides is that the more easy it is to make some of these foods, the more likely those foods are to survive. So being able to use your KitchenAid mixer, being able to have good pots that hold heat, that sort of thing. My grandma and my grandpa, for their interview, they did a joint interview and they made donuts. And they deep fried their donuts in a deep fryer that they put on their counter because they wouldn't anymore deep fry donuts on their stove. They consider it too dangerous. So some of those things, if the recipe is versatile enough, I think will survive and move on into the next generation. If you can afford the good stuff, then your success will be greater and you're more likely again to make it. And the other thing that I noticed that also I think there's a lot to explore there is the way that men and women both are able to use this kitchen space. My dad, for example, made pretzels, had absolutely no problem finding anything in the kitchen, made them perfectly until my mom showed up. And then he didn't know what pot to use anymore. I wasn't quite sure anymore anyway. But he's definitely capable. And my grandfather, with my grandma making donuts, often took criticism from her advice. And she had no problem doling it out. But as soon as he had something to say to her, she looked at him or turned, or, so there's a lot there going on, and I think that guys are making their way into the kitchen, and I think that they know how, and when they're allowed the space, I think that, what I saw anyways, that they're very capable. So I think there's a lot more to say about that there. So finally then, this is what I want to do the rest of my PhD, looking at branching out into the community, finding more families like mine that have 3 living generations, maybe even 4. And I think that as long as we're teaching our kids and showing them, I think some of these things will go on. And these pictures are just of my daughter. I was making a German cake with her, a chocolate chip cake anyway, and I dropped sugar all over the floor. And I was really mad, and I was really happy that my 1-year-old was at least sleeping in her crib. And so I went and got the vacuum cleaner, I left her on the counter, and I came back and she's covered in flour. A little bit like our recipe here that Gary told us about this morning. And just before I yelled or got upset, I watched her, and she was spooning out the flour into the KitchenAid mixer, turning it off, spooning a couple spoons in, turning it back on, and then by the time I got to her, because it didn't take me long enough, and I took some pictures, I realized that she had mixed my entire cake for me. She's 2.5. She was 2.5 at this time, So I think that there's a lot there to explore in terms of French-Canadian foodways, in terms of, teaching and seeing what the next generation is going to bring. And I thank you very much for listening to me today.
Hi everyone, can you hear me back? Yep. Well, I think that today is not as much about food, but it's actually about drink. So I'd like to share some thoughts with you about the role of coffee in negotiating memory. So specifically, I'm looking at the ritual of serving coffee and how this shapes memories and narratives of Iraqi immigrant women. So as part of my dissertation research, I conducted oral histories with Iraqi women living in Toronto and in Detroit. In the broader project, I look at how Iraqi women frame their memories of Iraq through dual and often dueling memories or narratives. So as feminist oral historians Catherine Anderson and Dana Jack suggest, a woman's discussion of her life may combine two separate and often conflicting perspectives. One framed in concepts and values that reflect men's dominant position in the culture, and one informed by the more immediate realities of a woman's personal experience. And I certainly found this to be true of Iraqi women. In the interview space, coffee, the way it was served, when it was served, and to whom it was offered, signified the kind of information Iraqi women were willing to share. Coffee frequently distinguished the formal and informal interview. And by this I mean the information women were willing to share on the record or as the tape recorder was rolling, and then the information that they preferred to wait until we were in a more private setting to share with me. So a social visit to an Iraqi home quite literally can stretch out over the course of a whole day, especially if nobody is willing to break the spell of politeness and tell the host that they need to leave. So as part of my fieldwork, I was frequently invited to these day-long celebrations where food courses would be mixed in with tea and coffee, and these would just continue to be served over the course of the day. But most of all, it was the ceremony of serving coffee and what this signified that most interested me about these cultural traditions. So the ritual of serving coffee is particularly important to understand because it initiates silent messages about status, space, and also intimacy. A visit to an Iraqi home will involve first the serving of a tea course, and then after a little while, the serving of strong Arabic coffee as well as baked Iraqi sweets and delicacies. So regardless of the time constraints, failing to provide coffee is considered to be a direct insult towards the family of the guest. In cases where there are actually time limits on a visit, coffee might be served at the beginning of the gathering. But the care and presentation of coffee also has meaning, and it often reflects both a family's means as well as the social standing of their guests. Tea then is formally served in stakhan, which are small, delicate, slender, clear glasses. And then coffee is brewed on the stove. It's most often steeped with cardamom and some other spices, and then served in tiny cups, which I'm sure many of you have seen are similar to espresso cups and saucers. And both of these courses are typically served with much fanfare, and they're often carefully planned to coincide with the arrival of more guests, the serving of food, or as I began to notice, to signify the division of the gathering into formal and intimate spaces. So since most of my interviews were conducted in the homes of Iraqi women, I was able to pay close attention to these details as I observed the ways in which I was regarded by the different participants. What I began to notice was when coffee was served immediately upon my arrival, which is typically considered improper, this generally meant that the participant only wanted to have a very short interview, and there was no invitation to stay behind and exchange stories after the interview was over. In some cases, there were practical reasons for this. In cases where I conducted interviews in places of business, in a coffee shop, or at social aid facilities. But it was in the home setting that these rituals really became an important indication of how the interview was going to unfold, and whether or not I would get to hear more than one type of narrative. So upon arriving at the home of an Iraqi Jewish participant in the fall of 2010, I was immediately served instant coffee in a mug. So aware of the possible connotations of this snub, I was very careful in kind of skirting around questions of religion and memory that I wanted to ask her. And I was, very politely trying to get this participant to elaborate on the very short responses that she was giving. But she rushed through her answers, and I was very disappointed to realize she had no intention of telling me about leaving Iraq and resettling in Israel. Towards the end of the interview, she paused to politely ask me about my family background and how I'd come to research Iraqi migration. And as soon as I mentioned that my father's family was from Iraq, she became extremely worked up and just started apologizing profusely. So I was initially a little confused, and it took me a few minutes to realize that over the phone she had assumed that I was British, and she had just served me instant coffee in a mug. So she said, had I known that you were an Iraqi, I would have served you good coffee in a proper cup. I was relieved and somewhat amused, and so I accepted her offer of coffee and klecha, which are Iraqi cookies made with dates and pistachios. And so we had this informal chat after the interview was over. So this was a case where the ritual of serving coffee indicated her regard for me as a non-Iraqi, or what she thought was a non-Iraqi, and also the strict boundaries of formality that she had placed around the interview space. This pattern of creating these formal and informal spaces within the interview was also revealed in another interview that I did with a lady who was a former collaborator for Kurdish guerrilla forces in northern Iraq. I interviewed her at her home in Mississauga in 2008, and this was at this point she'd already been living in Canada for over 10 years. This woman provided narratives that were so much in opposition to each other that I remember even at the time wondering how I was possibly going to be able to use these accounts and account for the discrepancies between them. So during the formal recorded interview, she talked about a united Iraq, the ways in which religious and ethnic groups in the north had coexisted for centuries without any conflict before the US had invaded in 2003. She gave no indication of her political affiliation, no indication of her family's involvement in as paramilitary fighters for an independent Kurdish nation. As I would soon learn, she had also withheld her personality from the record, and she had sat there stoically and recited the expected and often repeated myth of this united Iraqi past. So as with most interviews conducted in the privacy of the home, the recorded exchange often went on for several hours until we had exhausted all the topics that we wanted to cover. Or so I thought on this occasion. So as I switched off the recorder, began to gather my things, and was trying to make moves to leave, she insisted on serving me coffee and sweets. So I agreed, of course, knowing that not to take the coffee would have been considered highly offensive. So I settled in and I listened as she began to uncover a very different past from the one that she had shared during the formal or taped interview. So in this more intimate narrative shared over coffee, she fondly recounted her youth in Iraq and her many encounters with war, loss, and trauma. With the help of a photo album situated with great care and ceremony on the coffee table before us, she recited the story of her family and their involvement in the independence movement. She had been personally entrusted with a cache of weapons that were used by the guerrilla forces in Sulaymaniyah. So as she gazed at the picture of her father in the album before her, she began telling me these painful memories about his past, threading joyful memories with painful truths. So this is a quote from my interview with her. I remember the day my father was taken away. He was such a sweet man, so kind, everybody loved him. When I close my eyes, I can smell his aftershave and remember how he used to hold my hand as we walked down the street, greeting everyone, doing his business. He was an important man, my father, high up and very well respected. All my family were like this, yes, educated and respected. We were a good family. They killed him and would not return the body because he was tortured. So as the first of many interviews with this participant, I was surprised by the way in which her narratives contradicted and contrasted in both tone, content, and delivery. Since we've grown very close over the last 4 years, I've had the opportunity to ask her informally why she presented two such differing accounts. She was initially surprised by my questions, and she was laughing as she explained to me that the formal narrative of Iraqi collective memory is what she thought I would want to hear because I was writing about Iraqi history. When I asked her why she had shared with me then a second narrative that contradicted the first, she responded, well, I'm Iraqi, but I'm also Kurdish, and this means that I'm going to speak the truth. She explained by telling me that Iraqis have been raised on this collective remembrance of a myth that was created by the powerful Ba'ath regime. This myth now holds new meaning